Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our philosophical talks. The topic of this week's philosophical talk is philosophical limits, humility, and clarity. You will find out about the exploration of the limits of knowledge and our capacity to know, and to the wisdom it achieves. Mr. Friedman will remark the philosophical investigations from a philosophical perspective and how intellectual humility works as the hallmark of the greatest minds. Good morning, Mr. Friedman. Uh, Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick Nas. Thank you for the introduction. I also want to thank the U.S. Consulate in Almaty, Consul General Eric Meyer, Elmira, Dana, and the outgoing Tracy, who has been instrumental in making these talks possible over the last, well, more than a year. I gave an appreciation for Tracy a couple of weeks ago. So if you watch that talk, you'll be filled in on the background of my encounter with Tracy and what led to these talks largely. Yes, this week's talk is on philosophical limits, humility, and clarity. As always, there is a gap between when I conceive of the talk and when I actually give it. So there tends to be an evolution, a gestation that I welcome because it makes philosophy a living activity, a living art and practice. And as I've emphasized, that's central to the nature of philosophy, which is precise to circumstance. And one day's circumstance will be different than the next. And so one day's thoughts and inspirations will be different. And philosophy, to be impactful and to be rich in possibility, has to be responsive to these varying circumstances. The thought that came to my mind today as a way of introduction to this topic, and I think the topic is going to emphasize humility and the clarity that humility brings more than clarity per se. But the thought that entered my mind is one that I've referenced before, but I like to repeat, partly because these certain significant thoughts, quotations go through my mind repeatedly, and I find every time I encounter something, again and again, I see it differently. I understand it more deeply, and I think that's true for any hearer, especially of a difficult topic, a difficult subject, a subtle subject as philosophy is. So the philosopher Emerson, the 19th century American transcendentalist philosopher, often paired with Thoreau. Thoreau was effectively a student of Emerson's and was strongly influenced by Emerson's thought. Emerson famously remarked, "Great nations, great spirits are not boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life." Now that complements something that I've also quoted in the past from André Malraux's Anti-Memoirs about the chaplain of Glière during World War II, who, when asked by Malraux what confession had taught him about human beings, said, well, fundamentally, people are much more unhappy than anyone thinks. Sufficiently unhappy that boastfulness is a common response to the stresses and the feelings of insignificance that characterize a human race where there are so many human beings that people make comparisons to. Those comparisons are never precise, never rigorous. That's One of the points I've stressed philosophically, that we can never be in another's circumstances, we can never evaluate or judge, and our responsibility fundamentally, existentially, is to our own circumstances in their detailed elaboration. One of the problems that is the source of human pain, human suffering, is our failure to attend to what's always right in front of our eyes. And it's the uniqueness of our circumstance, the non-reproducibility of it, that's ultimately our dignity. It is that by virtue of which we exist at all, and it is the condition of the philosophic way of understanding religious salvation. And it has an even greater power than what religions imagine as the form salvation takes, simply because it's rigorous, it's incontestable. And so it can stand up in the face of any assault, anything that might attempt to diminish it. Well, we see manifestations, exhibitions of weakness everywhere. Humility is grounded in strength, boastfulness and arrogance and projections of one's capacities and one's accomplishments. That's rooted ultimately in a sense of weakness, a sense of insignificance that we're trying to compensate for. The American media mogul, Ted Turner, the person responsible for CNN, has said what motivated him to become this great economic success was the fact that as a young man, he was a C student in school. He felt inadequate, less than, the people around him. And so he compensated by working hard and creating an empire, a media empire. Empires are often grounded in these senses of weakness that, again, we try to compensate for because we're not appreciating the uniqueness of our circumstance that gives us our fundamental dignity and that grounds existence itself. We see this most conspicuously on the internet, right? On social media. Social media is largely people boasting, people proclaiming, what's special about themselves and their lives. One almost wishes that Emerson quotation could be the banner, for every social media site. Not boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life, where it's difficult enough without having to contend with the boastfulness and often the contrived representations of others. There have been documentaries recently about the media, about the social media world, about how it fundamentally operates. There are millions of people, I think 100 million or more, with 100,000 followers. It turns out that the majority of those followers are purchased. There are companies that sell vast numbers of followers for very modest sums. Even celebrities, through their agents, purchase followers so that they don't have to be embarrassed by having a small number of people attending to their communications. There's a site in Los Angeles. It's the interior of a private plane, but it's really just a photo studio. where people can book time and take photographs and pretend to be traveling around the world on their private jet. Well, that plane, that studio is booked 24/7. It's booked all the time in Los Angeles. There is such a demand for that type of background to create the illusion of, of a life that embodies what people think other people admire and will be envious of. Well, again, that's weakness. Every display of strength is weakness, no matter what, in every direction. We have that attested to in Sun Tzu, the great military philosopher and historian of ancient China, who wrote, "The supreme art of war is never having to fight, never having to exercise, display, show, use one's power. That's the supremacy, the supreme manifestation of power. Once you have to begin to exercise it, well, there's a weakness that you're responding to." And probably the extreme embodiment of that concept is not Wittgenstein, Kierkegaard's interpretation of Christianity. Kierkegaard was the 19th century Danish philosopher who is seen as the father of existentialism, even though he didn't use that term, and didn't quite achieve, well, let's say the clarity of the representation of existentialism that has now been articulated. But nevertheless, Kierkegaard is one of the great philosophers, of the Western tradition, and he was a Christian, and he was writing in his own sort of understanding of his enterprise to explicate, to explain, to explore the nature of Christianity and how it can be understood deeply and thoroughly. Well, he even wrote that all of his philosophical writings represented his own education in Christianity. Well, Kierkegaard stressed that when God decided to enter the world as Christ, as Jesus, when he decided to have his son enter this life to redeem it, to transfigure it, he had options. God had unlimited options. God could have sent his son. Again, we're working within the Christian sort of understanding, right, of God and his son. He could have sent his son into the world as a great conqueror. He could have sent his son into the world as Alexander the Great, as a conqueror greater than Alexander the Great, and taken over the world by just force of arms, and converted the world by that power, that manifest demonstration of irresistible force to Christianity, right? But that display of power would exemplify ultimately weakness. It's not an accident that, again, within the Christian sort of story, the Christian representation, God became man as a humble, a poor carpenter, without the majesty of office, without the power of arms. Right? not an accident, central to the Christian message, central to the Christian understanding, and central to the nature of ultimate power, which does not have to resort to arms. It's more powerful than that. You see a similar declaration in the story of Alexander the Great encountering Diogenes. Now, Alexander had great respect for philosophy and philosophers. He had been educated, tutored by Aristotle, right? One of the great convergences in human history, one of the greatest of all philosophers, teaching one of the greatest of all conquerors. Well, after Alexander's early conquests, he returns to Macedonia and then Greece, and he seeks out Diogenes, now maybe the most renowned philosopher at that point. And he finds him in Corinth. That's where Diogenes resided. Diogenes famously was an ascetic. He lived in a loincloth. He had a begging bowl. He had no wealth, right? He didn't need it. In the same way that Socrates would go to the marketplace and comment upon enjoying seeing all the things he did not need, he did not want. Well, Alexander, now one of the most powerful human beings in history, returns to Corinth with a retinue, with his generals, commanders around him, and finds Diogenes supposedly kneeling on the ground, drawing figures in the dirt. Alexander approaches. Diogenes does not look up. Alexander asks him, Diogenes, is there anything I can do for you? And Diogenes, still without looking up, says, yes, you can move out of my light. Now, the story may be apocryphal, may not quite be true, doesn't matter. It's been told, through the centuries, and it encapsulates, fundamental truths about the nature of power. As Alexander walks away, again, leading his train of men, he says, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes. He recognized the power that Diogenes manifested, right, in that simple life that did not need the displays of power and majesty that weaker individuals seek out, again, to compensate for what they feel are their deficiencies. Okay? Well, how does genuine strength manifest itself? Well, we've already seen in terms of the Christian sort of point of view, it manifests itself in the ultimate humility, right? The humility of a poor carpenter. But we also see it in other levels, in other directions. For example, Michelangelo is one of the greatest creative spirits, greatest creative talents in human history. He dominated the Italian Renaissance, one of the great creative periods in human history. He was, during that time, considered the greatest monumental painter of the era, the greatest monumental painter of the Italian Renaissance. He was considered the greatest sculptor since antiquity. He was considered the greatest architect of the Italian Renaissance. And he was also considered the greatest poet through his sonnets. This is a man of extraordinary power and presence and accomplishment. The supreme example of human creative power. Michelangelo signed only one of his works. He signed his early Pietà, the mother and Christ, after Christ has been crucified, he's been removed from the cross, and he is in the arms of his mother. It's the Pietà that's in the Vatican. It's one of the great sculptures ever executed. It's the only work that Michelangelo ever signed because it's the only work he ever considered finished. On his deathbed, Michelangelo said his last words, "I regret I die, just as I begin to learn the alphabet of my profession." That's the humility that you see manifest in the greatest power. Einstein remarked, "The difference between stupidity and genius is that genius knows its limits because it's always working up against them, right? We have expressions of that type of sense of limitation in minds of the rank of an Einstein. He was once talking with someone about mathematics. Someone was complaining to him about the difficulty of the subject. And Einstein remarked, "However great your difficulties are with mathematics, mine are even greater." And these are not false humilities. These are statements whose sincerity one can, in general sense, feel because they're consistent with, consonant with the entire attitude of these human beings to their enterprise. That they're committed to the highest standards. That's how they were able to achieve the kind of works that, that has become their legacy. But being devoted to the highest possible standards means you're always having a sense of falling short. Right? You're always struggling to move beyond limits that are all too manifest, all too obvious to oneself. There's another example that I like to cite. It's Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein embodies the philosophical spirit as much as anyone that I know historically. And when we're talking about the philosophical spirit, we're talking about a commitment to truth of the highest level. And that includes not just the truth about the world, but the truth about oneself. And a proper sense of oneself is filled with a sense of humility. Wittgenstein published just one work in his lifetime. That was called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Okay? Afterwards, he left philosophy. He thought he had solved all philosophical problems. That was his ambition, to solve all philosophical problems. And thinking he had done so, it was appropriate to leave philosophy. He didn't see philosophy as an ongoing enterprise, as a job, as a professorship. He didn't see it as an ongoing discussion. He saw it as something to end discussion, an instrumentality that can bring us peace by resolving urgent and desperate problems. Well, at some point, Wittgenstein realized the limitations in the views that he had developed in the Tractatus, and he returned to philosophy. He returned to Cambridge, and he began work on the work that would become really the basis of his ongoing and continuing to elevate reputation, the Philosophical Investigations. It was published posthumously. The introduction to the Philosophical Investigations is very short, and it ends with these words. I had wanted to produce a good book. This has not come about, but the time is past in which I could improve it. This is not false humility. This is his honest sense of his limitations in achieving the type of work he was aspiring to. Now, that work stands as one of the greatest works in the history of the subject. And it's remarkable not just for the philosophical ideas it explores and develops, but even for its literary style. But yes, it's not a finished work, and one could see the source of Wittgenstein's dissatisfaction in the same way when one looks at paintings by Van Gogh. One can see the struggle to represent a vision of the world, of human beings, that really exceeded even what Van Gogh was able to achieve, in his paintings, on his canvases. So again, not false humility. And that's what characterizes these individuals whose devotion is to the highest achievement, or solving the most difficult problems, or achieving the most definitive clarity. Not applause, not approbation, not fame. Lots of these individuals didn't seek fame and are not famous to the degree of individuals who did seek it. Einstein liked being famous. He is, and he enjoyed being famous. So did Newton. But Gibbs, a 19th century American physicist, chemist, theoretical chemist, one of the great figures in the history of science, is not known. He did not seek fame. Arguably, the greatest achievement in biology of the last 50 years, maybe the greatest achievement in biology since the elucidation of the structure of DNA, was accomplished by Wilmott. I doubt that most people that might be listening to this talk have heard or know who Wilmott is. Wilmott achieved the first successful cloning. He cloned Dolly, the sheep Dolly. When I was in molecular biology, the ultimate goal, the ultimate focus of so many researchers was to achieve a successful cloning, not just because of what that might be able to do as an instrumentality, but because of what that might help reveal about the nature of fundamental biological processes. It was for a long time, the holy grail of biological enterprise. Ian Wilmott is not famous. He could be as famous as anyone alive if that were his interest, but not. So fame, not an accident. Even Kierkegaard noted that the only people that should be public, the only people who should be broadly famous, are those who desperately do not want to be, but that nevertheless have something fundamental to contribute, to say. But these individuals that are undertaking achievement at the highest levels are devoted to the highest standards and are achieving and gaining satisfaction through the fulfillment of that enterprise and working towards those standards. And at some point, there's really no one in a position to evaluate their work. I mean, Van Gogh was doing art at such a level that, no, he wasn't appreciated in his lifetime, partly because the individuals that could appreciate him had not yet been born. That's certainly true in the history of a subject like philosophy, where typically it's only the greatest philosophers that are able to understand, appreciate the work of figures at that high level. Now, when we talk about philosophical humility, the place that we could begin and end is Socrates. Right? Socrates was famously proclaimed by the Delphic Oracle the wisest of all men, the wisest of all human beings. Now, the Delphic Oracle typically did not elaborate on its proclamations. They typically had an enigmatic character. The receiver, of the revelation had to interpret it for themselves, substantially. But Socrates' interpretation of that was that he was, if he was the wisest of all men, it was because he knew nothing. That's an ultimate statement of philosophical humility. And that's also a statement of clarity, right? To be in that type of position where we're not evaluating lots of different types of claims. It's not necessary. There's something fundamental about claims that make them inadequate to stand up in the face of possible assault, possible doubt from different directions. Now, part of my philosophical enterprise has been to understand exactly what it is that supports the type of, rejection of claim, rejection of knowledge. It seems that we know a great many things, right? So what exactly does Socrates mean? He's not just making a joke. I mean, he might be, but there's a way to understand it much more deeply. And I'm not going to try to understand or to say exactly what Socrates had in mind, because the fact is we don't have really any direct statements by Socrates. Most of what we know about Socrates comes through Plato, through his dialogues, and the character of Socrates in Plato's dialogues is as much Plato and infused with Plato's philosophical outlook and understanding as it is Socrates. And as time goes by, it's more and more Plato and less Socrates. And again, from a philosophical standpoint, all that matters is what is truth, and controvertible representation. We're not doing history, or we're not trying to like write biography and come up with a just representation of the life and thought of a historical figure. That's not the fundamental interest of, again, the philosophical pursuit. But we can understand Socrates' withdrawal from claims of knowledge through like what I've given as aphorisms, often to summarize from a certain direction my philosophical work. The past can't guarantee the future decides the past. That every claim to know something is actually provisional upon what comes next or what may come next. And there's always some possible set of future experiences that can undermine any claim that we make to know anything with certainty in our world, even claims as to whether this world is real or dream, right? I've often developed the idea that if the future takes a sufficiently radical, different direction, if it goes off in a sufficiently different direction than it has, then it can undermine any sense we've had of the past. If we wake up tomorrow to a totally different reality that persists, then this will have been dreamed. And everything we thought we knew about this experience will turn out to have been provisional, to have been wrong. So, since every claim of knowledge is really a claim about some aspect of future experience which we cannot know, well, in that sense, we can know nothing. Though, again, there are incontrovertible propositions that relate to what I call epistemic space, rigorous space. Past can't guarantee the future decides the past, that can be said to be incontrovertible, but typically they're moving in the direction of denying something that we think we know, right? So again, we're moving in the direction of a fundamental humility, recognizing that our circumstances don't admit of certain types of assertions or claims that often form the basis of endless debate and heated debate. Well, philosophy provides a deeper perspective that stops the arrogance of presumptuous claim or representation. One of the examples of humility at a high level that I like to give is something that involves Walter Jackson Bate, a professor at Harvard. When I was there, he was in the English department. He was a Johnsonian scholar. He was famous for his courses on, lectures on, writings about Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century English lexicographer. He wrote the first English dictionary. He wrote it by himself, over the course of 7 years. He was a moral philosopher. He wrote about human experience. He was a biographer. He wrote Lives of the Poets. He was a literary critic. He assessed poets. He wrote a masterful commentary on the works of Shakespeare that basically established Shakespeare about 100 years after Shakespeare's death as the preeminent English poet, the poet whose place in the language, whose supremacy in the history of English literature could no longer be challenged. Well, Samuel Johnson became famous from his English dictionary. That was the first major work that brought him to public attention. And Bates' lectures were among the most well attended at the university. I attended his lectures just as an auditor. I did not enroll in his course on Johnson, but like many people, I just went to hear him lecture. He lectured in the largest lecture hall at the university, and not only was every seat taken, the aisles were full. Literally, people were standing and sitting in the aisles of each lecture. That's how compelling Walter Jackson Bate was. But he was compelling because of the humility that he brought. He himself lived on campus. He apparently had an alcohol problem, but it was a problem that grew out of his sense of the difficulty, the challenge of the human condition that he felt Johnson understood and that Johnson's writings embraced, and that his moral philosophy could help us cope with the fundamental difficulties and challenges of the human condition. Well, nothing epitomized that aspect of Samuel Johnson's outlook and the embrace that Walter Jackson Bate had for Samuel Johnson and that outlook as the conclusion to the English dictionary. The conclusion to the introduction to the English dictionary. The introduction is a famous work in its own right. It ends movingly in a way that's evocative of how the introduction to Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations ends. It's a statement of deep humility. It's not a matter of boasting about his accomplishment. It's not a matter of celebrating his talents, his capabilities for bringing to the world, a dictionary of a language that had never been produced before, and having done it single-handedly when the French, when they undertook to write a dictionary of the French language, used the resources of the French Academy, 40 individuals, 40 highly educated men and women. I hope women at that time, maybe not, maybe just men, because we're talking a few hundred years ago. But it took 40 individuals 40 years to complete that task for the French language. For the English language, Samuel Johnson, working single-handedly, completed the entire task in 7 years. Well, he didn't celebrate that accomplishment, and he didn't boast of it. And he could have. It, again, is an accomplishment that made him famous, and that is one of the central features of his stature, as one of the greatest of all figures in the history of the English language, in the history of English literature. But the close of the introduction goes like this. I have protracted my labors till most of those whom I wish to please have sunk into the grave, and success and miscarriage are empty sounds. I therefore dismiss it with frigid tranquility, having little to fear or hope from censure or from praise. Again, this isn't false humility. This is the statement of one of the great minds, one of the great intelligences that England has produced, that Western culture has produced. But he understands the challenge of the human experience. He understands, as Emerson did, it's not a matter of boasting, it's not a matter of buffoonery, it's a matter of the difficulty and what might help us. And we don't help others when we boast. We don't help others when we proclaim our strengths and our achievements. We help others when, in humility, we convey what we understand, what has helped us, and the reality of our sober assessment of circumstance, not a contrivance, not taking photographs from the interior of effectively a movie set, to make it seem as if we're jetting about the world. That doesn't help anybody. It hurts people ultimately. And individuals that are devoted to truth, again, ultimately about not just the human condition, but about themselves, understand where value lies. And it lies in humility of representation, because that's the true strength. If you are strong enough, you don't need to display it. One of the examples I want to give goes in a slightly different direction. When I was in college, the great philosopher of Harvard's philosophy department was Willard Van Orman Quine. Quine was a mathematical logician and a philosopher. He's considered to be a candidate for greatest American philosopher of the 20th century. When I arrived at Harvard, just to give you an example of his stature, just a little anecdote, I met my roommate, who was a physics major. He went on to become a professor of solid-state physics at Cornell. He was put in charge of the undergraduate physics labs as a freshman. So he was enormously gifted, enormously talented in physics, and had obviously an extremely powerful intelligence. Well, one of the first things he said to me when we met each other was, and I don't think he knew my background. I was interested in physics and philosophy at the time. I ended up emphasizing philosophy for a variety of reasons, but he didn't know that when we had this encounter. He said to me soon after we met, "Do you know who's here? Do you know who's on the faculty? Quine. Quine is here." Well, there were also Nobel laureates in physics. I think Purcell, a Nobel laureate. There were lots of Nobel laureates on the faculty, but what impressed my roommate so much was Quine. And Quine does have the stature, to merit that type of response, that type of embrace. Well, I didn't really have a lot of dealings with Quine when I was an undergraduate. I was going in a slightly different direction philosophically, and I think I've mentioned that as distinguished a philosophical presence as Quine was, I was a little bit more drawn to significant historical figures. I was reading Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein, figures that for me were even greater philosophical intelligences than Quine. But Quine certainly deserves a lot of the accolades, that he received. And again, he was the preeminent philosopher on the faculty, considered at the time probably the greatest philosophy department in the world. The only sort of competing candidate was probably the philosophy department at Oxford University, and Harvard and Oxford were actually sister schools. So there was a lot of exchange between those departments. But Quine had an extraordinary reputation. And again, certainly the great philosopher of that department and of America at that point. Well, about 20 years ago, my philosophical work had reached a level where it was ready to be communicated. And I decided to go back to Harvard and to meet with members of the philosophy department and explain some of my results. I knew I was writing aphoristically. I was writing in a very concentrated manner. And so I knew that it would be difficult to understand my work just based on the aphoristic writing. It was so concentrated that I felt that verbal, oral communication would be almost essential for genuine understanding. Now, fortunately, I had a letter from the philosophy department, and I tell you this not to be self-serving, just to frame this. A letter from the philosophy department saying that I was as talented in philosophy as anyone in the history of the faculty. Okay, so that meant I could be taken seriously. Okay? That was important. Otherwise, I would, even as a Harvard student or a Harvard graduate, I wouldn't just be able to go and walk in, to people's offices or expect to engage, professors of philosophy there, especially since they're, and this is part of the point of the story, arrogant, often, by nature, except at the highest level typically, and that's going to be the point of the story. Well, I flew back to Harvard, and it turns out that I was given a pass that allowed me to fly first class back to Harvard. I didn't pay for it, I was given it. And while I was in first class, I had a little artwork with me, one of my poles that I just started to do. So it illustrated certain aspects of the philosophy. It made it visually accessible. And then I had some of my writings with me. And eventually, in the first class cabin, somehow my work became a topic of conversation among people in first class. So there was interest. I guess people maybe saw the artwork and they asked me about it and asked me why I was going back. And I told them, well, I've done philosophical work that I'm going to share with the Harvard faculty in philosophy. Anyway, and I was sitting next to a businessman who did work in Boston and Los Angeles. He would travel back and forth. And I was telling him, I'm going there, to share my philosophical results that, as I said, I thought would be more easily communicated in person and by mouth rather than in writing. Because again, the writing is hard. And he said to me, you think you're going to be embraced. You're their worst nightmare, he said. Just wait and see. I didn't, in my naivete, I didn't fully understand because, I was committed to the philosophical results. I was not attuned to the politics, of professional philosophy, quite honestly. Well, I get back to Harvard and I walk into the office of the philosophy department, and I have my letter, and that's basically my calling card, and it works. And the woman, the main woman in the office, directs me to Quine's office. He says he's in there, and just go in there, and you can show him the letter and talk, which I did. Now it turns out. And again, just to show you the importance of such a letter, he spent the first 5 minutes studying the letter, like reading it very carefully. Okay. And at the end of it, he said, "Okay, let's talk." Now, I was at that point 20 years ago writing aphoristically as I still am, but speaking aphoristically as I try not so much to do now, right? Because I find that's a difficult way to communicate philosophy. But I also thought that, well, these are professors of philosophy and they can understand concentrated forms of expression and representation. I was naive about that. The writing was just too concentrated to be absorbed on an initial encounter, even by Harvard faculty. Okay, but again, that's just because of the nature of the subject and the nature of my writing. Anyway, but I wanted to communicate. So in the case of Quine, I emphasized aspects of my work that dealt with the nature of logic, actually specifically the nature of tautology, how tautologies mean. Tautologies are propositions that in English take the form, a man is a man. It is what it is. What will be, will be. Propositions that seem not to say anything about the world, because they're of the form A equals A, and yet seem to embody the highest wisdom. And so the question is, how do such propositions really mean? How do they communicate in such a way that they seem to say nothing and everything at the same time? Okay? And my way of explaining that was to slow them down and to deal with the mode of anticipation that is set up when you begin to say a man is, and you anticipate a set of predicates. A man is here, there, tall, strong, whatever the description is going to be of the man, but instead you say a man, and it means by a denial of expectation. It turns out it means in a way related to how humor means, where the setup of the joke has you anticipating a certain outcome, and the punchline goes in a different direction. It's a denial or a thwarting of expectation. Okay. But in any case, I was explaining this and other aspects of the nature of logic that I was working to help clarify. Again, issues that were directly related to Quine's area of expertise. I was not trying to speak about something that he wasn't, conversant with, just to impress him with my ability to say things that he might not understand, right? Because I'd had some encounters in small groups with him, and I knew that, for example, he was not that conversant with existentialism, okay? So I didn't want to be talking about those types of issues. I wanted to be talking about issues of logic, because that was his area of expertise. Well, I thought, again, my mode of communication was understandable by people of the level of Quine, but no. And it was too concentrated, and it was different from, his thinking about the subject. And so at some point, he puts his hands over his head and says, "This is too much for me. You must go to someone younger. You must go to Nozick," another professor, Robert Nozick, who was more, younger, argumentative, somebody that I would engage, but and even be threatened maybe, but engage. It was sad in a way, again, because I wasn't trying to be difficult, but someone of Quine's level could admit that, could say that. This is too much for me. Essentially, if I were younger, maybe, but I'm not so young anymore, and it's hard for me to think in the way, that you're now demanding that I think in order to understand, what you're saying about the nature of logic. That's the humility, right? The honesty of a great American philosopher. Actually, before I went and talked to Quine, I called over to the UCLA philosophy department, again, because I lived in Los Angeles, and I spoke with Donald Kagan, who was their most celebrated philosopher. And I had a similar experience. He actually said this is over my head, but again, it's a testament to the humility, to the self-possession, the commitment to truth, the honesty that one can admit to a difficulty of understanding. Again, part of the issue was mine, that I didn't realize at that point, or I hadn't yet developed ways of explaining these things that made them more accessible rather than having to rely upon extremely concentrated forms, right? Almost a mathematical expression. Even, if you're a gifted mathematician, you're not going to necessarily understand somebody that speaks to you in equations, right? It takes time. Pascal, one of the great minds, great mathematicians, talked about how he would labor to understand people's proofs. So, and I realized eventually that I was writing a kind of verbal mathematics. But the point is, a Donald Kagan, a Quine, has the humility of that stature, right? That allows for that humility, that honesty. Well, the next day I did go and speak with Robert Nozick, but Robert Nozick, even though he was on the faculty, even though he's a distinguished philosopher, was not at the level of Quine. And not being at that highest level means that there's more defensiveness and arrogance. There's less humility. There's less honesty and intellectual integrity. And actually, Robert Nozick at the time was giving a lecture on the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. I stood outside his lecture room as I waited for him. And I've mentioned before that as far as the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics, there are no philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. There are implications that philosophy has for quantum mechanics, but quantum mechanics does not reflect back on philosophy. It relates to the nature of philosophy relative to the sciences. Philosophy inspired quantum mechanics, guided it. I've mentioned that Heisenberg and Einstein were doing the physics of existentialism, of what it is to try to represent the world from within, not without. Okay? But, and actually, some months later, I met with somebody who had taken a course that Robert Nozick was giving on the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics at Oxford during the summer, and they were saying to me he didn't really get the sense that Nozick had a strong sense of what he was saying. And that was my sense too, that he didn't. And at one point, I noticed he saw me, and I said to myself, if Quine has told him, about me and about meeting, about Quine's wanting Nozick to meet with me, he'll probably lose his place. And that's exactly what happened. And then Robert Nozick comes out, and he's defensive. He's he says to the students around him, because he walks out with a group of students around him, you must leave me as I need to talk with this person about whom I have been told, about whom I have heard. So Nozick had heard that I was coming from Quine. And I'm sure Quine said something extravagant because Nozick seemed completely uncomfortable. Like here was somebody whose intelligence I respected, and yet it was sad. But it was sad for a different reason. It was sad for his defensiveness. I talked quickly because I didn't know how much time we had. And at one point he stops me and he says, I'm going to need 6 months to look over some of your writings before I can really engage, have an intelligent conversation about this. And I said, well, okay, I can leave some writings, but honestly, they're very concentrated. And I think it's probably better if you hear some of these things from me. I can explain them, I think, in a way that is more understandable, more readily assimilatable than just reading these extremely condensed, almost, again, verbal mathematical forms. And I could tell he was struggling. And at some point he says, I'm not a conduit for the ideas of others, even though, of course, he's a professor at the university teaching the ideas of the great philosophers. And finally he says to me, well, can your philosophy fix my car? Now, it turns out that shortly before I went to Harvard, the molecular biological results came out about using modified viruses against cancer. And that was a direct application of the philosophical methodology in the realm of what I now call convergence theory. So there were a lot of things I could have said to him at that moment. What I said was, well, I'm not sure about your car, but it looks like it may be curing cancer. But the point is that Robert Nozick was not, for as distinguished, as accomplished he was, not at the level of Quine. Quine, not quite at the level of Wittgenstein. But at these highest levels, Quine and Wittgenstein and Michelangelo, Leonardo. At the end of Leonardo's life, he wrote in his notebooks, tell me if anything ever was done. This is a man whose Mona Lisa is considered the single most famous work of art in history. Tell me if anything ever was done. Because nothing was completed. Even the Mona Lisa wasn't completed. He worked on the Mona Lisa for 4 years and left it unfinished. His standards were impossibly high. So he was always struggling with a sense of limitation. And that's the type of spirit that embodies the entire philosophical enterprise, because the standards of philosophy are the highest possible standards, incontrovertible rigor, the limit of rigor. Anything short of that is not philosophy, is not what ultimately helps us decisively, not what ultimately, and again, I'll use a religious term, not what ultimately saves us, in the sense that it frees us, in the sense that it allows us to escape our sense of the general fate, because the general fate does not rigorously apply to any single individual at any particular place and time. And it's the concreteness of circumstance that allows us to escape that sense of universal doom, let's say, that's a presumption against all future time. So you see how philosophy pulls us back, pulls us away from claims to embrace a humility of understanding, and how simplifying that humility is. Any two things are approximately the same for some purpose. There are many purposes. Two things can be grouped together for all manner of reason, but they are rigorously different. And that difference is the ultimate simplification of our circumstance. It's, again, what's expressed in Lear's comment to, in Kant's, the king's counselor, comment to Lear, all teach you differences, that Wittgenstein was going to use as the introduction to his philosophical investigations, but instead, what did he use? Because that has a little bit of a harsh tone to it, right? Well, instead, consistent with our theme, he used a statement of humility, a statement by a quotation from the Austrian playwright Nestroy. It is in the nature of every advance that it appears much greater than it actually is. Again, Wittgenstein is understanding, how historical perspective changes, how what strikes us as phenomenal can eventually take its place, in a history of accomplishment. So we see humility operating at all levels, but manifesting itself at the highest level in the most celebrated, the most accomplished, the most powerful of minds. Now, I wanted to conclude before going to some questions. I had one question from last time that I want to address. I want to conclude with actually the conclusion, or almost the conclusion, of the books of Joshua, that actually gives a poetic version of some of the content, the philosophical content of what I discussed with Quine in that meeting. Now, again, when I read or recite from Joshua, I recognize that it's hard to understand all of the ideas, but I'm partly doing it just so you're exposed to the sound of it, because the sound carries part of the meaning, and it gives you a sense of the spirit, of the philosophy. Now, again, this is dealing mostly with the issue of the nature of tautology, of how propositions like a man is a man can seem to say nothing and yet everything. And they do it by setting up an expectation a man is, that then is denied with the simple predicate, a man. A man is not any of the things you're imagining I'm going to say about a man. It's just a man. And again, without going into all the details of it, again, I'm going to recite this partly for the sound. Okay? So, a rose is a rose, as everyone knows. But what deeper truths do tautologies disclose? With Cordelia dead, and through tears that burn, Lear will discern, as best he can, that a man is a man. And this will have taken a lifetime to learn. Yet we have not yet seen how tautologies mean. Let's study an ocean in slow motion. A man is what? Tall, strong, a warrior, an heir, here, near, over there. As Eckhart's daughter, we can only stare and answer a man against expectation of predication, common or rare. It means as humor by thwarting what we expect, denying our sense of what must come next. And knowledge is a demonstration of just such expectation, and its walls confine as prevarication. But rigor demurs, finding means to doubt what we think must come about, as the past is a prison, and this the way out. We wallpaper the future with prints from the past and marvel that pain can last and last, as if guesswork were gain and rigor too plain, as if two things could ever be the same. But that they cannot is what we forgot in journeying far from Eden. Okay, so that's almost the end. There's a little section right after that of the books of Joshua, but that gives you a little bit of a sense of what I did discuss with Quine. Again, it was technical, but the point of my relaying some of that conversation was to show you how humility manifests itself at the highest levels of every subject. And that's why I gave examples of Michelangelo and Leonardo and Wittgenstein and Samuel Johnson, Socrates, and others. Okay, now, there was a question from last time, and let me read it. The question is, what is your opinion on the peculiarity of the American Revolution in philosophy and history? Okay, now, I have to admit, I'm not totally clear on exactly what's being asked, especially in terms of peculiarity. But let me say a few things. It may not be exactly what's being asked, but I'll offer, some perspective, that for me is central to my understanding of the American Revolution. For one thing, modern revolutions all tend to be influenced by philosophical currents, philosophical ideas. Now, one of the things that distinguishes the American Revolution is exactly what ideas inspired it. And those ideas are largely that of the English philosopher John Locke. He wrote about the natural rights of man, right? Natural rights of human beings. In previous epochs, the right to rule and the right to establish law was in the hands of the king, of the queen, of the monarch, who was ruling by a divine right. And so in the way that the Pope is a vehicle, a voice of God, of God's will within the Catholic tradition, the monarch was seen as having the ability to make law, to pass judgment, because he's or she is imbued with a divine sanction, a divine authority. That is not the view that John Locke is embracing, right? John Locke was an empiricist philosopher, one of the people that contributed to the development of science as a philosophical method. And John Locke stressed, again, the natural rights, the inalienable rights of human beings. He had a view of humanity that ran counter to that of, well, most famously, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes felt that human beings needed to be in a circumstance where government was controlling behavior. Without government, life was nasty, brutish, and short. And human beings were fundamentally not good and could not be trusted with self-government. And so a monarch, at least a benign monarch, represented the best form of government. Well, for John Locke, human beings were fundamentally good, um, and and could govern themselves and had that fundamental right. And John Locke saw ultimate governmental authority as resulting from a contract between human beings and the government, where certain rights and powers were given over to the government, as long as the government respected, honored, and benefited the people that it was governing over, that it was fundamentally serving. So that notion of a contract, became central to John Locke's thinking. It actually was central to the thinking that inspired the French Revolution, but that was the result of ideas articulated by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract. The French Revolution was inspired by Rousseau's writings, the American Revolution by John Locke's writings, but they had a similar temper, a similar sort of orientation where human beings were fundamentally good and had the right to self-government and the right to change governments if their interests weren't being served. We also see like subsequent revolutions, like in the 19th century, early 20th century, influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, another philosopher, another set of philosophical ideas. So one of the things that's unique to the American Revolution is the influence of the ideas of the philosopher John Locke, and the rejection of divine authority for an embrace of the natural rights of human beings that were sacred, sacrosanct, that government could not rightfully infringe upon. Okay? So there's that aspect. I've mentioned before that the American Revolution involved a British colony in the New World. Sort of, the British were not much interested in the goings-on in the New World, except insofar as there was conflict with France, the other great superpower, of the time. The 7 Years' War was a war that was played out in the New World between Britain and France. Britain triumphed in that war, but that war was expensive. It was expensive for Britain. It was expensive for France. The expense of the war for Britain led Britain to impose more and more taxes on the Americans that had been now accustomed to being left alone. We had an ocean between America and Great Britain. It wasn't that easy, to transit. So there was a sense of isolation, a sense of an independent existence that the American colonists were enjoying. Well, after the 7 Years' War, Britain, began to clamp down, began to impose its will, its authority. And not having had that will, that authority imposed previously in such a way, led naturally to a rebellion. The French Revolution, by contrast, happened in the center of European civilization and represented a direct assault on the traditional structure of European society, the feudal structure of society that the French Revolution was replacing with egalitarian ideas developed during the Enlightenment. So those are some distinctions. Okay. Do we have a little time. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do have one question.
Okay.
Mr. Friedman, how to feel good enough in this hectic, highly competitive, and complex world?
Yes. My response to that is you compete, you know, at your own prerogative. I am not fundamentally competing. I am fundamentally trying to elaborate like philosophical ideas that rise to the demands of my circumstances. Now, one thing in terms of competition, I'm always aware of the distinction between my circumstance and that of everyone else's. So I am not envious of other people because they're living a fundamentally set of different experiences than I am. I have my particular capabilities that I developed that I feel I have a responsibility for. So I am I'm basically adopting in my life the philosophy that Voltaire espouses in his work Candide, where Candide is exploring the world, exploring the philosophy of Leibniz, that this is the best of all possible worlds, and finding that a world of so much suffering can hardly be the best of all possible worlds. But what is Voltaire's advice at the end of that celebrated novella that I recommend everyone read, Voltaire's Candide? And by the way, I've talked about Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein did an opera, of Candide. The final advice is we must go and work in the garden. In other words, as I've said previously, the advice of Goethe, Einstein's favorite author, is if you would be happy, you must do your duty. And what is your duty? The demand of the hour. So I am attending to my circumstances, the demands of the hour as they present themselves to me. It's and in terms of like judgment, there's a line that I heard just recently. Apparently, it is common in drug treatment programs, drug treatment facilities. Compare and despair. Right? Don't compare yourself to others rigorously. No comparisons are ever justified. Any difference between you and anyone else means that whatever rigorously applies to you need not rigorously apply to the other person. Attend to yourself. And then in terms of like I've always stressed the Hindu proverb, you become what you admire. Go in the direction of your deepest admirations, whatever those admirations are, and regardless of whatever limitations you feel you might have. Because an earnest pursuit of your admirations can eventually lead to unexpected results and unexpected fulfillments. I've often given the example of Van Gogh, who began painting when he was 27 without any clear demonstration of talent. But he had a commitment to the activity, to art, to a vision. He said he wanted to paint men and women with that something of the eternal, which the halo used to represent, and which he seeks to give through the actual vibration and intensity of his colors. It became a lifetime, a decade-long pursuit, enterprise that he was still trying to achieve, at the end of his life. But the point is, starting without any demonstration of talent, he emerged as the most popular great painter in history. So I pursue admiration, my admirations, my philosophical admirations, independently of how others might assess them. That's my fundamental responsibility. So, and again, to summarize, you become what you admire, and at the end of the day, you must do your duty. And what is your duty? The demand of the hour as it presents itself, and ultimately, you must go and work in art. Okay?
That is all for today. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I guess that will be it for today. We will have a talk next week. I think the topic for next week I already know. I will announce it right now, and that is the philosophy of parting and absence, do not suffer that it ends. And it's going to be partly a tribute to Consul General Eric Meyer, who will be leaving. He's a friend of mine, and he's also been instrumental in facilitating these talks. So I'll be talking about parting and absence and how to address them and cope with them and triumph in the face of their challenges, which is one of the great challenges of the human experience.
Right. Thank you so much for your talk today. It was extremely interesting, and I'm sure all the viewers also enjoyed it. So let's wrap up for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Hope to see you next week. Bye now.